Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for that very warm welcome. Before I start, I would just like to thank the Joint Committee on Climate Change, the Central Bank of Malaysia, and the Securities Commission of Malaysia for putting on this fantastic conference. Now, what I want to do today is I want to tell you three stories. There are three stories about swimming. There's swimming in extreme environments, and I hope it gives us some food for thought as we discuss the importance of protecting our precious planet. So let me start with the first story. This is a photograph of me diving into the sea in 2007, about to undertake the first swim across the North Pole. I'll never forget that day. Just to put this water temperature into perspective for you, a normal indoor swimming pool is 27 degrees centigrade. When you swim across the English Channel in summer, it's about 18 degrees centigrade. Now drop all the way down to 5. That's the temperature of the water into which the passengers of the Titanic jumped and perished. Fresh water freezes at 0. The water at the North Pole is even colder. It's minus 1.7 degrees centigrade. It's unbelievably cold. And the night before we arrived at the North Pole, we all had dinner together. I then said goodnight to everybody. I went back to my cabin. I closed the door. I closed the curtains over the porthole. I lay down on my bunk and I tried to sleep. Well, I closed my eyes and I remembered 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11, midnight, 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, the Inuit people, so the indigenous people who live in the Arctic, they say that in every single person, there is an almighty battle taking place. And it's a battle in the mind between two wolves. There's a good wolf and there's a bad wolf. And which wolf is going to win in this epic battle? Well, it's a wolf which you feed. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, I realized that I had spent the whole night just feeding this bad wolf, thinking about all the things that could go wrong when we arrived at the North Pole early the next day. Anyway, finally, eventually, I fell asleep. And predictably, then at 6 o'clock, there's a knock on the door. It's my coach, David. He says, "Morning, Lewis, how are you feeling?" I said to him, David, I don't think that this swim is possible. And he looked at me and he said, No, Lewis, this swim is possible. We all believe that this swim is possible. I said to him, David, with all due respect, there's only one of us who's going to be in the water today, and that's me. I don't think that this swim. So I wanted to do a full kilometer, which we thought would take me round about 20 minutes to complete. I said, I don't think this swim is possible, looking at these conditions. He said, Lewis, I want to give you 2 anchors. And I want you to remember these 2 anchors between now and when we get to the North Pole. And whenever you doubt yourself, whenever you think that this swim is not possible, I need you to hold on to these 2 anchors. He said, the first thing I want you to do is, I want you to walk all the way back to the beginning of your life. And then I want you to walk to today. And I want you to remember all those moments in your life which have molded you into the person you are. All those pivotal moments. He said, when you were a young boy, you grew up in England and then you moved out to South Africa. And he said to me, your parents took you to all those national parks. You told me this many times. He said, I want you to remember with as much detail as possible driving into that first national park. Well, I'll never forget it because it was the Addo Elephant National Park. And as we drove in, we were surrounded by this huge herd of African elephants. You know, having grown up in England and now suddenly being surrounded by elephants, this was Africa. This was amazing. And David said to me, he said, Lewis, your love for the environment, it didn't grow up in a vacuum. And then he said, and then I want you to remember your next big thing in your life is when you swam across the English Channel. Now, the English Channel obviously starts in England and then right the way across to France. We all thought that it would take me around about 10 hours to complete this swim. At 9 hours, my coach came to the edge of the boat and he said, Lewis, he said, there is a strong current. It's pulling you along the French coast. Swim, Lewis, swim, swim. And I swam as hard as I could, but there was no ways I was going to beat this current. And eventually, 15 hours later, I finally put my feet on the French coast. And David said to me, he said, and I remember what it felt like when you turned around and there far in the distance were the white cliffs of Dover. Remember that with as much detail as possible. And then he said, and the final thing I want you to do is I want you to remember that you grew up in South Africa and you studied law in the in the early 1990s at the end of apartheid. And some of your lecturers and some of your fellow students were imprisoned, fighting for justice, fighting for equality against the apartheid regime. He said, never forget that. Every single generation will face its issues. But the defining issue of our generation, he said, will be the health of the environment. And he said, and if you still doubt yourself, what I want you to do is I want you to think about the second anchor. And what I want you to do then is I want you to walk all the way to the end of your life. I want you to turn around and I want you to ask yourself a very, very simple question. And that is, why are we here today? You know, I had spent the previous 7 summers up in the Arctic swimming. Every single year I saw the sea ice getting thinner and thinner and less. And I literally saw glaciers retreat up valleys. He said to me, he said, Lewis, we have this one opportunity tonight when we arrive at the North Pole for you to do a symbolic swim to show world leaders what is happening here. He said, I urge you, please, Lewis, to find the courage deep down inside you to dive in and to go for it. He then left me and I was on my own in the cabin until the early evening when we finally arrived at the North Pole. And I remember walking onto the upper deck of the ship and looking out over this icy terrain. But everywhere there were these enormous open patches of sea. This was the first time in human history that the North Pole had unfrozen like this. And my doctor, Tim Noakes, was next to me and he said to me, Lewis, I wonder what this place will look like in another 50 years' time. Anyway, we then walked off the ship, we walked down onto the ice, we walked right up to the edge of the sea ice until we could look into the sea. And we made that most stupid mistake. We looked into the water and the water was completely black. It looked like a giant ink pot. It was absolutely terrifying. The Russians called the Arctic Ocean the Black Ocean. The water was completely black. And it was absolutely terrifying. Anyway, over there was David, my coach. He comes running up to me. Underneath his arms, he's got 10 flagpoles with national flags on them. And he said to me, he said, Lewis, I've got an idea. I want to change your plan. Now, I'm not the type of person that trains literally for 5 years to undertake a swim. And then 10 minutes before we get into the water, we're going to change our plan. But David is, he's exceptional. He said to me, he said, Lewis, our whole team consists of 29 people and we come from 10 nations. Not all of us could be here today. And so I got all the national flags of those 10 nations. And I wanted to put them over there at the North Pole. Okay. And then I wanted you to dive in here, swim along the edge of the ice until you get to those flags and that'll be your beacon. He said, but this is my plan. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put one of these flags at every 100-meter mark. And then all I want you to do is I'm going to tap you on the shoulder. You dive in. You just swim 100 meters until you get to that first flag. I want you to slow down. I want you to look at that flag and I want you to think about all the men, all the women from that nation who've inspired you so much and helped you so much to be here today. And when you've done that, I want you to do another 100 meters until you get to the next flag and so on and so forth until you get to the end. He said to me, it's crushingly obvious. The idea of swimming a full kilometer in this water, it looks impossible, but I know that you can do 100 meters. I just thought this was a fantastic idea. It broke this swim down into manageable chunks, and it was also very inclusive. This wasn't just a British expedition or a South African expedition. This was an expedition made up of people from 10 nations. What I hadn't anticipated, though, was what was going to happen next. Suddenly we have this major argument in our team. Which flag's going to go first? Which flag's going to be in the middle? And which flag is going to be over there at the North Pole? And as everybody is arguing this out, I thought to myself, actually, which is the most important flag? And then it dawned upon me. For me, it wouldn't be the first flag, although that's an important moment when you start anything in life, or the halfway mark, which is obviously very reassuring. For me, the most important flag would be this flag over here, the flag at the 900-meter mark. And I say this and I am as guilty as anybody else. But sometimes in life, things are so difficult, they're so arduous, they're so hard that we often give up at the 900-meter mark. And when we do that, it's what can happen is that quitting can very, very soon start becoming a habit. And so I looked amongst all these flags and I thought to myself, okay, which one are we going to put at the 900-meter mark? Well, we were very, very lucky. We had an Australian in the team. His name was Jason Roberts. He was the cameraman on the expedition. Now, as I've explained, I'm half British, I'm half South African. And obviously there is a good rivalry between Britain and Australia. There's a fierce rivalry between South Africa and Australia. In fact, there's a fierce rivalry between almost every country and Australia. And so I leant down, I picked up the Australian flag, I walked past Jason Roberts, the Australian, handed the flag to my coach, and I said to him, you put the Australian flag at the 900-meter mark, because there is no ways on this earth that I will ever give up in front of an Australian flag. And so once that was all sorted out, David came up to me and he said, Lewis, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. I want you to focus your mind, get yourself ready, and then I'm going to tap you on the shoulder and I want you to swim straight to the North Pole. So I'm standing there by the edge of the ice and we go from 5 minutes to 4 to 3 to 2, and I can feel this angst building up inside my stomach. You know, the world is divided between pioneers and followers. You're either a pioneer or you're a follower. You can't be both. And if you're a pioneer, you don't know what's going to happen until you dive into the water, because nobody else has been there before. And so all the worry, all the angst, all the risk is on your shoulders and your life. And so this was very, very overwhelming. But I just tried to put it to one side. Then David said, okay, Lewis, he said, 30 seconds. Are you ready? I said, I'm ready. He goes, okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. And as he said 1, this thought came into my mind and it literally froze me there on the ice. I just couldn't dive in. The thought was, if things go horribly wrong now, how long will it take for my frozen corpse to sink the 4.5 kilometers all the way to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, which is kind of not the best thought to have when you want to do the first swim across the North Pole. But quite by coincidence, we had arrived at the North Pole at 11 p.m. on the 15th of July, which was the exact same time, the exact same day that my father had died a few years previously. And I'm thinking about my mother at home. I'm thinking, if I kill myself here today, I leave my mother without her husband and her son. So I said to David, David, if things go badly wrong, don't let me do the 4 kilometer. Pull me out halfway. He came up to me, he grabbed me, he pulled me away from the edge of the ice. He said, what are you doing? If you dive into this water, preparing to swim a kilometer, but also thinking about getting out halfway, you're going to be confusing the most important part of you, he said to me, and that's your subconscious, because you're preparing for victory and defeat in your mind at the same time. He said to me, Lewis, now is the time to believe in yourself, to believe in us as this team, and to carry your message. There is nothing more powerful than a made-up mind. And so we walked back up to the edge of the ice. He gave me a second countdown. He went 3, 2, and as he said 2, I just dove straight into the Arctic Ocean. 18 minutes and 50 seconds later, I climbed out on the other side of the North Pole. I was obviously absolutely frozen. It felt like I'd been in there for 18 hours. But I came out with a renewed determination that what I have seen in the Arctic and in the Antarctic is profound. The changes which are taking place in the polar regions are happening so quickly, they will impact every single person on this planet, every single future generation, and the whole of the animal kingdom. So I came out with this renewed invigorated determination to share this message with heads of state, with businesses, and also with ordinary members of the public, and to urge them now to do everything that we can to protect these last great wilderness areas on Earth and to tackle the climate crisis. Which brings me to the second story. I love this photograph. So this is a photograph which was taken by a photographer called Kelvin Troutman, and it was taken at Land's End, which is the most southwestern point in England. This photograph is a photograph of me running into the sea, about to attempt to swim the full length of the English Channel. So just to give you some background, just over 2,000 people have swum across the English Channel, so from England to France, but nobody had swum the full length. So the width is 32 kilometers, the length is 528 kilometers. And there I was down at Land's End, about to attempt to swim from Land's End all the way to Dover. And again, I remember the night before asking myself those questions. Have you got it inside you to be able to do such a mammoth swim? Is this even possible? Nobody's ever attempted this before. Anyway, I got down to the beach the next morning. My whole team were waiting for me there. And I walked up to them and I decided to make 3 promises to my team. The first one was, I said, I'm going to leave all my doubt here at Land's End. The second promise I'm going to make you is that every single day I am going to swim 10 kilometers. And the third promise, if we can't go out because the conditions are so rough and so dangerous, we can't even get the support yacht out, then I promise you that on the next day, I'll do a double session. I will swim 20 kilometers. I then shook all their hands. I dived into the sea and I started swimming all the way up the English Channel. The first week was absolutely magnificent. The sky was bright, it was sunny, the water was nice and warm and flat. I swam all the way to Plymouth, where I grew up as a young boy. From Plymouth, around the bottom, and then across Lyme Bay, a very, very long swim. And then eventually we get to the halfway mark, which is Portsmouth. And at Portsmouth, everything changed. Then we had storm after storm after storm coming up the English Channel. And some days it was literally impossible to go out and do the swim. And so the next day we would wake up nice and early. We would sail out to where we stopped the swim previously. I would then dive in. I would swim 10 kilometers, have something quick to drink, tread water, and then do another 10 kilometers. I'd then get out. We would sail all the way back to the nearest harbor. I'd have a few hours sleep. Probably only about 4 hours sleep because we had to sail so far. And then I would get in and have to do another 10 kilometers. And this is the way the swim went for the second half of the swim. Day after day after day. It was absolutely unrelenting and swimming in some extreme conditions. Eventually though, after 49 days of swimming, I arrived in Dover. And this is a picture which Kelvin captured of me arriving at Dover. There's the wall, the harbour wall at Dover, and me putting my hand up against that wall. I had completed that swim. Now, what I haven't explained to you is the reason why I was doing this swim. I was doing this swim because I was urging the British government to properly protect the waters around the United Kingdom. So the waters around the United Kingdom are 720,000 square kilometres, of which just seven are fully protected. And what I mean by fully protected is there's no drilling for oil, there's no drilling for gas, there's no great big industrial fishing fleets dragging their nets over ancient coral. The Royal Navy aren't doing gunnery exercises there. So we're allowing nature to recover. And it's only 7 square kilometres. Now, Sky News had agreed to do daily coverage during the swim. And so every single day I was on Sky News saying, British government, we need to properly protect our waters. We're facing a climate crisis. We're also facing a biodiversity crisis. You know, when I was a young boy growing up in Plymouth, the waters around the United Kingdom, they were bountiful. And now start looking at them, the state they are in. We need to properly protect our waters. Well, I was saying this day after day after day. And so when I got to the end, there was the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, to meet me. He said, Lewis, we've heard you. I said, Michael, I wish you'd heard me before I had to swim for 49 days. He said, what is your message? I said, the science is very, very clear, Michael. We now need to be protecting at least 30% of the world's oceans now by 2030 for our oceans to stand any chance of recovering. He said, thank you. I'll take this to the Prime Minister. He took it to the Prime Minister. A month later, the United Kingdom government agreed to this target of protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. And what is more, they went to the United Nations and they urged other nations to join them with this endeavor. Since then, another 84 nations have joined the United Kingdom. So 85 nations have made this commitment. This is turning out now into the largest conservation drive in history. It's so incredibly exciting. But the reason why I'm telling you this swim is because I don't believe that I would have been able to dive in there and swim the full length of the English Channel and go through all those storms, deliver the message to the British government, and then follow up and get all these nations to agree to protect 30% of our oceans had I not made those 3 promises to my team at the beginning at Land's End. Which brings me to the final story. So this is a photograph taken by a photographer called Michael Walker. The mountain in the background is Mount Everest, the highest mountain on this earth. Here I am undertaking a swim in a glacial lake on the Khumbu Glacier. This is back in 2010. So I went to Kathmandu. From Kathmandu, we walked for 2.5 weeks until we got up to very, very close to Mount Everest, to a lake called Lake Lukla. And there I decided just to do a quick test swim. I dove into the water and I swam there for about 8 minutes. I got out, no problem at all. And so the leader of the expedition, who used to be a general in the British Army, he said, Lewis, I feel confident. Let's go up onto the main mountain and let's do this big swim. Now, the reason why I was doing this swim is because the glaciers in the Himalayas, they are also now beginning to melt away. But the situation there is even more serious because this water, these glaciers provide a constant water supply to India, China, Bangladesh, Burma, all Pakistan, all these important countries rely on this water. There's nothing that you can do without water. This area is a cocktail for conflict. And so I was going to go up onto Everest to do this swim. So we climbed from Lake Lukla, we climbed another 3 days. In altitude, we only climbed up another 300 meters until in front of us was this lake on Mount Everest. My coach David is next to me. He said, are you ready? I said, I'm ready. He said, okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. And I dove into this lake and I started swimming as hard and as fast as I could across this lake. Well, you can imagine what happened. In less than 30 seconds, I realized I was in huge problem. I just couldn't move my arms. My arms literally felt like lead. I was gasping for air. We're at 5.5 kilometers above sea level. The oxygen is so little there. I then started choking in the water. I slowed down. I stopped. Luckily, this lake was very, very shallow. I pushed myself up for the bottom. I took a couple of deep breaths. I said, don't stop, Lewis, because if you stop, you're going to get cold as well. I put my head down and I started swimming. Then from the corner of my goggles, I see the general screaming at me to get out of the water. I swim towards him. He runs into the water. He grabs me. He pulls me out. And he said, Lewis, it's all over. He said, I'm sorry, Lewis, but the way you're swimming now, he said, you are going to drown. And you're just going to be another person that kills themselves on this mountain. I'm taking you off this mountain now as quickly as possible. And so he walked me down the mountain all the way to a little village called Gorakshep. And there we put up our tents. And there we spent 3 days getting more oxygen into our bodies. And at the end of the second day, the general came up to me and said, Lewis, would you like to have another go at the swim? I said, yes, I would. He looked at me and he said, I feared that would be the case. He said, if you want to have another go at this swim, you need to take a radical tactical shift. A radical tactical shift. He said, why are you swimming so quickly? And I held up my hand and I said, well, after the North Pole, my hands were so cold that it actually took me 3 months to feel this hand again. he looked at me with this real sheer exasperation. He said, "Lewis, this water's warm." I said to him, "What are you talking about? The water's 2 degrees. He said, "It's relatively warm. Stop being fussy." He said, "This water is much warmer than what you've swum at the North Pole. The issue here, Lewis, is not the cold. It's lack of oxygen." He said, "So what I recommend you do is as follows, and please listen to me. Instead of swimming as quickly as you can, I want you to swim as slowly as you can, so to preserve the oxygen." He said, "The second thing I want you to do is, instead of swimming crawl and you've got your head in the water, I want you to swim breaststroke, and then you can breathe whenever you want to. And lastly, Lewis, instead of swimming with all this aggression, I want you to swim with real humility." And he looked up to Mount Everest and he said, "You cannot bully Mount Everest." He said, "You must change or you will drown." And, when you get a stark message like that, you have no other option. I listened to him, and then the next morning we started walking back up to that lake. And I remember arriving back up at that lake and feeling so nervous. Some people say that drowning is the most peaceful death. Where do people come with this ridiculous comment? Drowning is the most peaceful death. I was terrified. I'm standing by the edge of the lake. There's a young Nepalese Sherpa there called Sanjeev. He says, "Come over here, Lewis." We sat down on a rock. The Nepalese people have got these beautiful little prayer flags. He put them up there. He lit some incense. And he said to me, "We're not going to move until everybody is calm and everybody is relaxed." And so the two of us just sat there and we watched as this team of Sherpas left base camp and started walking up the Khumbu Glacier all the way to the highest point on this earth. And then eventually, as they disappeared into the clouds, I felt ready. I stood up, I shook his hand, and I slowly walked into the water and I started swimming across this lake breaststroke. For the first 250 meters, there's no problem at all. For the next 250 meters, there's also no problem at all. But when I get to the 600 meter mark, suddenly I'm getting really cold. I get to the 700 meter mark, I'm even colder than I was at the North Pole. I get to the 800 meter mark and I think to myself, if I don't switch right now into crawl and sprint the last 200 meters as quickly as I can, I am going to die in this lake. I'm just about to go into crawl, and from the edge of my goggles, I can see Sanjeev screaming at me. I pull my head out the water to hear what he's saying, and all he's saying is, "Slower, Lewis, slower, slower." And so I swam those last agonizing 200 meters until I finally got to the end. He was there, he grabbed me, he pulled me out, he gave me this most enormous hug and a huge kiss. The British general walked up to me and he didn't give me a hug nor a kiss. We learnt two really, really important lessons there on Mount Everest. The first is obvious, and that is just because something has worked in the past, and that's the way I'd swum my whole life, fast, aggressive crawl. Just because something has worked in the past doesn't necessarily mean it'll work today, and it certainly doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow. And the second lesson, and it's also one about change, and that is we can change our speed, we can change our stroke, but for real, for effective change to take place, we have to be prepared to completely change our mindsets. What I want to do now is I want to bring these three stories back to you and relate them to you living in Malaysia. What have these three stories got in common? Well, the first story, what was that about? Well, that was about undertaking a swim across the North Pole in unimaginably cold conditions. But it was also a story about diving in and committing 100%. The second story, about swimming across the English Channel, that was a story about building good habits. Remember those three promises which we made, or I made to my team. Good habits get you through tough times. They make you more resilient. And the third story, what was that about? Well, that was about undertaking a swim on the highest mountain on this earth, but underlying it was a story about change. Sometimes we have to break old habits. We have to change. We have to be adaptable to get the job done. And how does this all relate to you? Well, these messages about swimming are equally as applicable to the fight against climate crisis. The first thing that we need to do is we need to be committed. We need to dive in 100%. The second thing we need to do is we need to become resilient. Okay? These changes which we need to make are going to be tough. We need to be resilient. And the last message, we need to adapt. We change or we will drown. It's really that simple. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for listening to me today. Thank you very, very much, and I hope the rest of the conference goes very, very well. Thank you.